The night the debt woke up again, the rain came down hard enough to wash the oil off the highway, and the roar of engines cut through it like knives. Brick Malone rode at the front with his jaw tight and his eyes burning from old memories he never talked about, the kind that stayed awake even when he slept, because the call had come from a hospital 2 towns over, and the voice on the other end had said a boy's name he had not heard in years, a name that dragged him back to a cold afternoon. Outside a rundown gas station, when a skinny kid with dirt on his face and fear in his eyes had stood in front of Brick's bike and asked him for a promise instead of money. And Brick, younger then but already broken, had laughed once and then given it without thinking, because promises were cheaper than hope until the bill came due. Now the bill was screaming in fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells as Brick pushed through hospital doors, still wearing his cut, rain dripping off the leather, boots leaving dark prints on the floor while a nurse tried to stop him and failed because something in his face said stopping him would be a mistake, and inside the room a young man lay pale and shaking, ribs wrapped, one eye swollen shut, and Brick saw the boy he once was layered over the man he had become, saw hunger and pride and stubborn fire, and the boy whispered his name like it was a lifeline and said they took my sister, they said I owed them. And Brick felt the old scar in his chest, ache as if it had been cut open again. The memory came fast and sharp, the way it always did. The kid in torn shoes asking for a promise that Brick would look out for his family if trouble ever came. Brick telling him, "Don't grow up fast, kid. It ruins you." And then riding away thinking nothing of it, because bikers ride and the world turns and debts fade. Except this one had waited patiently, and now it was standing in a hospital room with blood on its hands. And Brick knew before the doctor finished talking that whoever had done this had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, because the boy's sister was gone, taken by men who thought fear was currency and silence was safety. Brick stepped back into the rain and called the clubhouse with hands that did not shake, his voice low and steady, telling them to roll, telling them it was a promised job. And when the bikes gathered on the highway under broken streetlights, the sound was not loud but heavy, like thunder held in check. And Brick thought about how every choice had a cost, and how some costs you paid years later with interest. And he wondered if redemption was just another word men like him used to sleep at night. The clubhouse lights burned warm against the dark as he walked in, faces lifting, questions already forming, and he told them plain and simple that a boy had been hurt and a girl taken, and it was on them now, because family did not ask twice, because loyalty was not a word but an action, and because sometimes justice came on 2 wheels and did not ask permission. And as the room went quiet and the rain hammered the roof, Brick felt the weight of leadership settle heavier on his shoulders, the weight of being the man who decided who bled and who lived. And for a second he hated himself for how easy the decision felt. But he did not stop. He never stopped once he started, because stopping was how you died inside. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain eased by the time Brick rode back out alone to clear his head, empty highway stretching ahead like a confession, the engine humming beneath him. And he thought about the men who would move in the shadows now, the kind of men who hid behind badges and paperwork or muscle and guns, men who took girls because they could. And he promised the night what he had promised the boy years ago, that he would not look away, not this time, because promises were heavy things and he was done, pretending otherwise, and somewhere in the dark a line had been drawn that would not fade, only deepen, until blood or truth filled it. By dawn the clubhouse smelled of burnt coffee, wet leather, and tension that clung to the walls like old smoke, and Brick stood at the head of the scarred table with his hands flat on the wood, eyes moving from face to face as the brothers filed in. each carrying his own history and purpose, because this was how they always gathered when things turned serious. Not with speeches, but with presence, with the quiet understanding that whatever came next would be faced together. First, through the door was Axe, built like a wall and just as hard. The club's enforcer who spoke little and listened less, his knuckles already taped out of habit, followed by Cole, lean and sharp-eyed, the strategist who had once planned routes for convoys in a war he never talked about. Then Doc slid in with his medic's bag slung over his shoulder, even though nobody was bleeding yet. His calm face a reminder that consequences were not abstract. And behind him came Latch, the lookout, restless and twitchy. Fingers always tapping like he was counting seconds, even when time stood still. And finally Mason, the youngest but not naive, the one who handled money and contacts with a brain that moved faster than most men's fists. Brick waited until the door shut and the lock slid home before he spoke, telling them about the boy in a hospital and the sister taken, about the promise made years ago and the debt now due. And he did not dress it up or soften it, because lies had no place here. And when he finished, the room stayed quiet for a beat before Axe snorted and said, "Then we ride." Boss, simple as that. But Cole raised a hand and said, "Simple gets people killed." And Brick nodded because that was the balance they lived in, muscle and mind, heart and caution. The debate started low and slow, voices overlapping. Doc asking who took her and what state she was in. Latch saying he'd already heard whispers about a crew running girls through warehouses near the river with help from a badge or two. Mason flipping open a notebook and listing names of properties and shell companies, his pen scratching like a warning, and Brick listened more than he spoke, because leadership was not about noise, but about knowing when to let the room breathe. They talked about Sheriff Calder, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes and a reputation for cleaning up his own messes. A man who liked to remind people that the law was flexible if you bent it the right way. And when his name landed on the table, the temperature dropped, because going after a cop was not like crossing a rival gang. It was stepping into a storm that never ended, and Brick felt the old scar tighten again as he weighed the cost against the promise. The faces of his brothers against the face of a scared kid asking for mercy. Axe leaned forward and said Calder bleeds like anyone else. Doc warned that bleeding brought heat. Cole laid out a plan that started with eyes and ears instead of guns, mapping patrol routes and shifts, watching who came and went from the warehouses, identifying the men who moved the girls and the men who protected them. And Brick saw the club settle into its rhythm. Banter cutting the tension just enough to keep it from snapping. Latch cracking a joke about sleeping when he was dead. Mason reminding him that paperwork killed faster than bullets if you let it. And Brick felt that familiar surge of pride and fear that came with knowing these men would follow him anywhere. They split. Tasks without ceremony. Latch on night watch along the river. Mason digging into Calder's finances. Cole coordinating silent recon runs. Doc prepping supplies and checking the hospital again for the boy's condition. Axe staying close to Brick like a shadow, because some threats did not announce themselves. And as they moved, the sense of inevitability grew, like a train you could hear long before it arrived. That night, Brick rode with Cole through empty highways, the world narrowed to headlights. And wind, planning spoken in short bursts between stretches of silence. Talking about contingencies and exits, about how to pull a girl out without leaving bodies behind if possible, about what happened if Calder made the first move. And Brick admitted something he rarely did, that he was tired of burying people and tired of letting bad men sleep easy. And Cole said, tired or not, you're still the man for this, which was not comfort, but truth. Back at the clubhouse, the phone rang with news that Twisted the Knife, Latch reporting increased patrols near the river. Unmarked cars. Men with earpieces who did not belong. And Mason confirming that money was moving fast through Calder's accounts. Like he was preparing to disappear, and Brick felt the clock speed up, because when rats ran it meant the walls were closing in. They gathered again under the same lights, faces harder now. And Brick laid out the next steps with a voice that did not waver, telling them they would watch and wait one more night, confirm his sister's location, because charging blind was how promises turned into funerals, and Axe slammed a fist once in frustration, but backed down because even he knew the difference between rage and resolve. As dawn crept in again, and the club settled into uneasy rest, Brick sat alone at the table, staring at the wood grain like it held answers, thinking about how every brotherhood was tested by the lines it chose to cross, how loyalty could save you or damn you depending on who you were loyal to. And he knew the line was already behind them, because Calder would not stop once he sensed movement, because men like him never did, and somewhere a girl waited in fear while the world debated costs. And Brick made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like gravity, knowing the collision was coming whether they were ready or not, knowing the road ahead would be soaked in consequence. And as the engines fired up again in the dark, the sound rolled out like a warning to anyone listening that the Brotherhood was moving and there would be no turning back. The collision came sooner than any of them expected, not with sirens or gunfire, but with silence, the kind that creeps up and makes your skin itch, and Brick felt it in his gut before Latch's voice cracked over the burner phone saying they'd moved her. Warehouse empty, bed stripped, blood on the floor that was too fresh to ignore, and Brick closed his eyes for half a second because this was the part he hated, the part where planning met reality, and reality did not care how careful you'd been. They regrouped fast, bikes tearing through back roads under a moon that offered no comfort. Cole piecing together fragments as they rode, saying Calder wouldn't move the girl unless he knew he was exposed, which meant someone had talked or been seen, and Brick's mind ran through every step they'd taken, every shadow they trusted, feeling the weight of leadership turn sharp as guilt, because when things went wrong the blame always stopped at the top. They found the answer waiting at the clubhouse in the form of a smashed door and a single body slumped against the wall, a prospect named Eli bleeding out on the concrete, eyes wide with shock more than pain, and Doc dropped to his knees immediately, hands steady even as his voice tightened, saying, "Stay with me, kid, stay," while Brick knelt too, gripping Eli's hand as the boy whispered sheriff's man, unmarked, took something from the office, took Mason, and Brick felt the world tilt because Mason was not muscle. Mason was the brain, the one who knew where the money led and where the secrets slept, and that meant Calder was no longer hiding. He was hunting. Eli died with a breath that rattled and stopped, and Axe stood up slowly, face unreadable in a way that scared Brick more than rage, because Axe's quiet meant violence was already decided, and Brick knew there would be no clean extraction now, no silent rescue, because Calder had crossed from corrupt to open war, and wars demanded choices that left scars you could not see. They moved Mason's books out before the place filled with heat, Cole directing traffic like a conductor, Latch keeping watch, Doc covering Eli with a jacket that felt too small for the weight of what they'd lost, and Brick felt something harden inside him, a line snapping into place, because the promise had turned into a reckoning and there was no walking it back. The call came an hour later, Calder's voice smooth and amused, saying, "You boys sure make a mess," saying Mason's smart, but not smart enough, saying the girl was safe as long as Brick remembered his place. And Brick listened without interrupting, because he needed Calder talking, needed the man comfortable enough to make mistakes, And when Calder said, "Meet me alone at the old courthouse by the river if you want them both alive," Brick said, "I'm on my way," and hung up before terms could be set, because some negotiations were just traps with manners. Axe immediately said no. Cole said it was exactly what Calder wanted. Doc said he couldn't lose another brother tonight. And Brick took it all in and then made the shocking decision he knew would fracture them, telling Axe and the others they were not coming, that this was his mess and his promise. And when Axe stepped forward with a low growl, Brick held his gaze and said, "If you follow me, you put the girl and Mason in the ground." And the room went dead quiet, because Brick rarely played that card. The one that said leader over brother, and it cut them all. Brick rode alone to the courthouse, the building looming like a rotted tooth against the river fog, memories flooding him of a time when he still believed the law meant something, when he thought lines were clear, and he parked under a broken light and walked in with his hands visible, heart steady in a way that surprised him, because fear had burned out and left only purpose. Calder waited inside with 2 deputies and a man Brick recognized as a fixer from the docks. Mason bound to a chair, face bruised but eyes alive, and the girl standing behind Calder, wrists zip-tied, chin lifted in defiance that broke Brick's heart. And Calder smiled and said, "See, we can be civil." And Brick said, "Let them go, and you get me." And Calder laughed and said, "You already gave me more than I wanted," because the betrayal slid into the room like poison when one of the deputies stepped forward and pulled off his badge to reveal a cut underneath. Club colors Brick knew too well, a brother from a neighboring charter who had sold them out for protection and profit, and Brick felt the old wound reopen. The one that said loyalty was fragile and men broke easier than promises. The room erupted before words could catch up, Axe crashing through a side door with Cole and Latch, because of course they'd followed, because Brotherhood did not listen to orders that smelled like suicide, gunfire cracking and echoing off stone. Brick tackling Calder as the fixer went down, Doc's voice shouting from somewhere as he dragged the girl free. Mason flipping his chair with a ferocity that said brains did not mean weakness. And in the chaos, Brick locked eyes with the traitor and saw shame flicker too late, because some debts could not be repaid. When the smoke cleared, Calder lay bleeding, not dead but broken enough to never wear a badge again. The traitor gone into the river with a weight that would keep him honest, and Brick stood in the wreckage feeling no triumph, only the hollow aftermath of survival. Because they had won the moment and lost something else. Innocence maybe, or the illusion that promises were simple. And as sirens wailed in the distance and the Brotherhood scattered into the night, Brick knew the reckoning was not over, that consequences were already on their way, and that the hardest part was still to come. The reckoning did not arrive with the dawn, but with the slow grind of days that followed, the kind where wounds stiffen and grief settles into the bones, and Brick felt every mile of it as they laid Eli to rest under a gray sky with engines idling low, like a prayer none of them expected answered. Doc standing apart with his hands clasped, Axe staring at the dirt as if daring it to move, Cole watching the tree line for threats that never came. Because even funerals were not safe when the law was. Sickened men like Calder still had friends. The girl, Sarah, stayed at the clubhouse under watch, quiet but unbroken, helping Doc clean and cook, asking questions about her brother with a strength that humbled Brick. And when the boy woke and learned she was safe, he cried without shame. And Brick understood then that promises did not end when blood stopped flowing. They continued in the living, in the care you gave when the noise faded. Calder did not die, which turned out to be worse because broken men talked, and as his case crawled through courts and internal affairs, names leaked like oil into water, deputies resigning, warrants popping up like landmines, and Brick watched the system devour one of its own with a satisfaction that felt thin, because justice done by paperwork did not bring Eli back or erase the nights the girl would wake screaming. And still it mattered, because consequences mattered. And Brick had chosen a path where he would accept nothing less. The club tightened its operations, quieter now, smarter, Cole insisting on layers and redundancies. Mason, freed but changed, returning to his books with a scarred smile and a sharper edge, because captivity taught lessons no classroom could, and Axe stayed closer than ever to Brick, a silent guardian who had seen his leader bleed in ways no one else had. And Brick led him, because leadership also meant knowing when to lean. The final confrontation came not with Calder, but with the men who filled the vacuum, a rival crew backed by Doc Money who thought the clubhouse was weakened, who rolled up one night with engines loud and guns cheap, and Brick met them on the road instead of letting the fight reach the walls, a line of bikes under sodium lights. Rain starting again like the world's favorite punctuation, words exchanged that meant nothing, and then the clash, brutal and fast, fists and blades and shots fired into asphalt. Axe going down and getting back up with blood in his teeth, Doc dragging him clear, Brick taking a hit that sent stars across his vision and answering with a blow that ended the argument. And when it was done, the rivals retreated with less than they came, leaving the message written in pain that some territory was not for sale. Axe survived, but would never throw a punch the same way again, and Brick sat with him in the hospital listening to the machines hum, feeling the cost settle like a ledger finally balanced. And Axe said through a grin that hurt him, "Don't you dare get soft now, boss." And Brick laughed because laughter was still allowed. Even here, weeks later, when the court date arrived, Brick stood in the back as Calder was sentenced. The man smaller now, stripped of power and certainty, and Brick felt nothing like victory, only a quiet closing of a door, because the world did not need another martyr or monster. It needed accountability, and this was as close as it came. The promise came full circle on a cold morning when the boy stood in front of Brick's bike again, older but steadier, thanking him without begging, offering money he did not have. And Brick shook his head and said, "Keep it, go live, that's the deal." And the boy asked what he owed instead. And Brick said, "Remember who showed up, and show up for someone else when it's your turn, because debts that traveled that way made the world survivable." The clubhouse returned to its rhythms, jokes rougher, silences deeper, scars earned and worn without apology. And Brick sometimes rode alone at night, empty highways stretching out like a question he did not need answered, thinking about how leadership was a series of endings disguised as beginnings, how redemption was not a destination but a practice, and how promises were not chains if you chose them freely. On one such ride, he passed the old gas station where it had started, lights flickering, a kid sweeping the lot. And Brick slowed just long enough to see himself reflected in the glass. Older, heavier, still moving, and he rode on, the engine steady beneath him, knowing there would be more calls and more lines to draw, knowing the club would answer because that was who they were, and somewhere behind him a debt lay paid, not in money or blood alone, but in the quiet knowledge that when a promise was asked for in the dark, it had been kept. If you like this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and let us know which part of the story hit you the hardest. Your support means more than you know.